They buried him alive. That is not speculation. It is a fact, hidden in plain sight for more than a century. And it begins with a photograph, not a casual snapshot, not a staged family portrait, but a post-mortem image, taken in a time when death was a performance, when mourning was ritual, and when science itself was blind to one of its darkest failures. In the winter of 1852, in the quiet countryside of Yorkshire, England, the Ashford family faced tragedy. John Ashford, the eldest of 3 brothers, was dead, or so they believed. His death certificate, signed by the local doctor, recorded sudden death, cause unknown. No sign of illness, no evidence of trauma, just a still body, cold to the touch, eyes closed, lips pale. In that era, the Victorian obsession with preserving memory meant one thing. The family commissioned a post-mortem photograph. Sitting in their parlor, flanked by grieving relatives, John's body was arranged in repose. His younger brothers, Thomas and William, posed beside him. The image, still preserved in faded sepia, became the family's keepsake. But the photograph hides something no one at the time could have understood, something that would not be uncovered for decades. In the photograph, John's face is strangely alive, not in the way grief imagines a smile, but in the way a body clings to life. His lips have a faint flush. His posture is unnatural, the fingers slightly curled, as if reaching, an unnatural stillness that hides a struggle. The Ashford family buried John 2 days later. The coffin was sealed, the grave dug, and life moved on. But beneath the soil, something impossible had happened. Almost 70 years later, a routine exhumation, ordered for reasons buried in bureaucracy, would reveal the truth. John Ashford had been buried while still conscious. That photograph was not a memorial. It was the final record of a living man trapped beneath earth, his silent screams forever locked in glass. This is not just a story about death. It is a story about fear, the fear of mortality, the fear of what lies beneath, and how institutions, bound by protocol and ego, bury truth as ruthlessly as they bury bodies. Tonight, I will take you deep into the Ashford case, through the photograph, the burial, the decades of silence, and the horrifying discovery. And when you see what was hidden in plain sight, your perception of death and of history will never be the same. The Victorian era was obsessed with death. It was not merely the end of life, but a theater, a ritual, a language of grief and control. Mourning was codified. Coffins were sealed quickly. Death was recorded in photographs, daguerreotypes that were both keepsakes and evidence. But behind the ritual was something far more sinister, a medical system that feared uncertainty more than it feared error. John Ashford's death fell into that shadow. The morning of November 12, 1852, began like any other for the Ashford household. Thomas, William, and their mother moved quietly through their small cottage in Yorkshire. John had complained of fatigue the night before, but such ailments were common, especially for a laborer accustomed to long days in the chill. By midday, he had stopped speaking altogether. His breathing slowed. His body became cold. Within hours, the doctor was summoned. Dr. Henry Calder, a respected physician in the county, arrived without hesitation. His verdict was clear: sudden death. No sign of illness, no wounds, no reason. Calder recorded it formally. Cause of death undetermined. But the language of certainty is powerful. Once spoken, doubt fades. John Ashford's fate was sealed. Yet there were signs overlooked or suppressed. The family later recalled that John's body had a strange rigidity. His fingers remained curled as though clutching air. His lips bore a hue that seemed inconsistent with death. Thomas remembered his brother's breathing being odd, though at the time he could not articulate it. In those days, there was no system of verification, no mandate to confirm death beyond a doctor's word. Death could be declared with a simple signature, and the patient's voice, the patient's struggle, might never be heard again. This was not error alone, it was systemic. The Victorian medical establishment operated with a stubborn arrogance. Medic. Mine was still bound in mystery, a mixture of superstition and science. Institutions were determined to believe in closure, even if that closure was built on silence and ignorance. The Ashford case was not unique. Across England, countless bodies were committed to the earth under mistaken declarations of death. Some, like John Ashford, would awaken too late. The photograph taken of John Ashford was meant to be a tribute, but it was something far darker, a frozen testimony to the limits of medical knowledge and to the willful blindness of those who hold authority over life and death. Later, the coffin itself would speak, not in words, but in scars, in the soil, in bone fractures, in evidence no Victorian mind could bear to confront. By the end of this journey, you will see that John Ashford's story was not about an isolated tragedy. It was about a system designed to obscure truth, and about what happens when truth emerges decades too late. The photograph was taken 2 days after John Ashford's burial. It was not simply a photograph. It was a ritual, a Victorian theater of grief. In the mid-19th century, post-mortem photography was not uncommon. It was an art form born of necessity, a way for families to preserve memory in an age before cameras were everywhere. But it was also a reflection of a culture obsessed with death and with controlling it. For the Ashford family, the photograph was meant to be closure, but closure has a price. For Thomas and William, standing beside their brother in that silent parlor, the image was both a memorial and a mystery. They could not yet know that decades later it would become evidence of something far darker. The photographer, James Elbridge, was known in Yorkshire for his skill in post-mortem portraiture. His work was solemn, precise, almost ritualistic. He arranged John's body in the family's parlor, seated in a chair by the window so the light would fall gently upon his face. His brothers were positioned beside him, Thomas resting a hand upon his shoulder, William's gaze fixed in quiet sorrow. The photograph froze the scene, grief made tangible, stillness made eternal. But in death, stillness can be deception. Modern historians, examining this same image, have found subtle anomalies, details overlooked by generations. The angle of John's fingers, the slight lift in his eyelids, the unnatural tension in his neck. These are not flaws of photography. They are signs, signs of life mistaken for death, signs that, in another time, might have saved him. The photograph became the Ashford family's most precious possession. It was framed in oak and kept in the parlor for years. For Thomas and William, it was a memory of their brother. But for the world decades later, it became a record, not of death, but of survival, and of a crime buried beneath soil and silence. Victorian England thought of death as final, but John Ashford's photograph tells a different story. It speaks of uncertainty, of error, and of a world where the line between life and death was not just blurred, but erased. And this was only the beginning. Because the Ashford photograph did not remain a family secret, it would resurface decades later in an investigation that would shake medicine, history, and belief itself. After John Ashford was buried, silence fell over the Ashford family like a shroud. Grief became a quiet ritual, unspoken yet persistent. In that small Yorkshire cottage, Thomas and William moved through their days with the weight of something unsaid pressing on their shoulders. The photograph remained in the parlor, framed in dark wood. Every visitor who came to the Ashford home would notice it. The stillness of John's figure, the unnatural calm, the way his body seemed to resist the quiet finality of death. But nobody said the words. Nobody spoke of the possibility. For decades, Thomas and William lived with the photograph as a private relic. It was not merely a memory of a brother. It was a reminder of a question they could never answer. Had John truly been dead when they buried him? Victorian death was quick to be accepted, unchallenged. In 1852, the declaration of death was final and the sealing of a coffin irreversible. There were no safeguards, no mechanical monitors, no protocols beyond the physician's signature. That signature carried the weight of truth, and in the Ashford case, that truth would remain buried, both figuratively and literally. For Thomas and William, life moved forward. William took his place as head of the household after their mother withdrew into silence. Thomas left for London, seeking to escape the shadow that lay over their home. But the photograph stayed. It became something almost sacred, a silent witness to that terrible morning. Years passed. The photograph faded. The cottage grew quiet. Yet the image, frozen in glass, kept its secret. It was an unintentional testimony, a relic of something no one at the time dared to admit. That John Ashford's burial was not a ceremony of rest, but a chamber of desperation. And this silence was the first part of the conspiracy, not a conspiracy of evil intent, but of human arrogance. Institutions of medicine, of law, of family, all determined to accept closure rather than confront uncertainty, to look away rather than ask the hard questions. The Ashford photograph was not meant to survive as evidence, but evidence has its own will. And nearly 70 years later, it would speak again. It was the winter of 1920 when the coffin was opened. Nearly 70 years had passed since John Ashford's burial. The world had changed, science had changed, and so had the rules of memory. The exhumation was ordered quietly, without fanfare. Local records mark it as routine. Land was being cleared to expand a nearby churchyard. Bodies were to be moved, graves reorganized. Among them lay John Ashford, resting beneath damp soil and years of secrecy, but what was uncovered would shatter the illusion of closure forever. Dr. Marcus Fenwick, a rising figure in forensic pathology, oversaw the process. Known for his meticulous work, Fenwick approached the case with neither spectacle nor sentiment. When the coffin was opened, the first thing he noticed was how remarkably preserved it was. The oak wood, sealed in earth rich with clay, had kept its occupant in a state unlike any other. But what followed defied all expectation. The body inside was not as still as it should have been. The skeleton showed clear signs of movement, not post-mortem collapse, but desperate, violent struggle. Arms extended, hands pressed against the coffin lid, fingers bent as if clawing for air. The fingers bore deep abrasions, grooves cut into the bone that could only come from sustained effort against a solid surface. Small fragments of wood were embedded beneath the nails. Fenwick's examination revealed more. The position of the body had shifted. The rigid repose of the coffin's arrangement was broken. John Ashford had not lain peacefully in death. His remains spoke of panic, of suffocation, of a last fight that no one had heard. The most disturbing discovery came when Fenwick examined the skull. At the base were microfractures, subtle but unmistakable. These were not wounds inflicted before death. They were the result of extreme internal pressure, the desperate beating of a living heart, trapped in darkness. Fenwick wrote in his report, "The evidence is unequivocal. The deceased regained consciousness inside the coffin. He fought for freedom. He died not of natural causes, but of asphyxiation and terror. This was no simple mistake. This was a living burial, a reality the Ashford family had never been told, a truth deliberately buried with John." The photograph taken in the parlor decades earlier, the one they kept framed for years, was not a portrait of death. It was a portrait of a man in the grip of the unimaginable. And this photograph would not stay silent forever. The photograph of John Ashford the one taken in the dim parlor of the Ashford home, was never just a keepsake. It was an artifact of denial. For decades it hung on the wall, framed in black oak, a constant reminder of grief. But hidden within it were the clues no one was willing to name. Victorian post-mortem photography was meant to preserve memory, but in this case, it preserved something far stranger, something dangerous. Modern analysis of the Ashford photograph reveals a quiet horror. Subtle signs that John Ashford's body was still alive when the image was taken. There is the unnatural flush of his lips, not pale as death would demand, but tinted, a trace of blood still coursing through veins. The fingers, curled in ways that suggest tension rather than peace. The slight lift of his eyelids, as though resisting the finality of closure. These details, unnoticed for decades, now speak with chilling clarity. For the Ashford family, however, the photograph was a locked chamber of the past. They never dared question it openly. To do so was to admit the unspeakable, that their brother had been buried alive, that their grief was built on silence, that the world they trusted to protect life had failed him. This photograph became a psychological relic. It shaped Thomas and William's lives without them knowing. Thomas left Yorkshire forever, carrying the image in his mind like a burden he could never lay down. William stayed, but the shadow of John's death lingered over his home, his children, his dreams. The photograph was a puzzle piece in a story too dangerous to complete. Victorian society had no language for living burial. The medical establishment had no protocol for verifying life beyond pulse and breath, and families had no means to challenge authority. That image, frozen in glass and light, became an unintentional witness to a crime against the living, a crime that would not reveal itself until long after the last mourner had gone silent. By the time Dr. Fenwick's report emerged in the early 1920s, the Ashford photograph was no longer just a relic of mourning. It was evidence that would ignite a debate about death, about trust, and about the limits of human certainty. And yet, decades later, the deeper truth would emerge. This was not just a medical tragedy. It was part of something far larger, a history of fear, secrecy, and control that stretches back centuries. Halfway through this story, I need you to do something. In the comments below, write the phrase, "the silent witness," twice, not just to remember this moment, but to lock in what you've seen so far, to anchor yourself to the truth buried in shadows, because what comes next will pull you further than you ever imagined. After the photograph was taken, life for the Ashford family continued under a quiet veil of grief. But grief in Victorian England was not static. It was layered, unspoken, and often unresolved. For Thomas and William Ashford, the image of their brother became a silent question they could never answer. For decades, nobody revisited John Ashford's death. Medicine moved forward in fits and starts, but the idea of verifying death remained primitive. Doctors continued to declare deaths by the barest examination, a pulse checked by hand, breath sensed by ear. That was enough, until it wasn't. It wasn't until nearly 70 years later, in 1920, that silence would be broken. A land dispute forced the exhumation of several graves at the Ashford plot. It was an unremarkable task, bureaucratic and routine, until Dr. Marcus Fenwick arrived. Fenwick was no ordinary physician. He was a man fascinated by the boundary between life and death, a man who had dedicated his career to uncovering the truth buried beneath centuries of assumption. Fenwick had seen cases others dismissed, and when he opened John Ashford's coffin, he found what no one dared speak aloud: unmistakable evidence that John had been buried alive. His body was not the still repose of the dead, but the evidence of struggle: claw marks on the coffin lid, bone fractures consistent with desperate movement, a skull fractured from internal pressure. Fenwick's report was uncompromising. It shattered the Victorian illusion of certainty. The deceased regained consciousness inside his coffin. The struggle was prolonged, violent. Death was not final until his will to live was extinguished. For the Ashford family, that revelation was a bitter reckoning, but for the wider world it was a warning that death, as humanity understands it, is not absolute, that the authority of doctors and institutions is not infallible, that in their pursuit of closure they may seal away truth along with life itself. And the photograph, that faded sepia image of John Ashford and his brothers, became more than a relic of mourning. It became proof of a crime committed not by malice, but by a willful blindness to a dangerous possibility. This was not simply a medical case. It was a story of hidden agendas, of institutional silence, and of a truth buried for generations. And this truth was about to pull us even deeper into the Ashford Brothers' mystery. The truth about John Ashford's burial was never just about a single man. It was about a system, a culture, a set of institutions that placed certainty above conscience, closure above truth. Victorian England was built on order. Death was not merely a personal loss. It was an administrative act. Physicians, churches, undertakers, all participated in a chain of ritual that reduced dying to procedure. But that procedure left no room for hesitation. To delay burial was unthinkable. Sanitary laws demanded haste. Social norms demanded finality. And the authority of the physician demanded trust. Dr. Henry Calder, the man who declared John Ashford dead, was not a villain. He was a product of his time, bound by medical ignorance, trained to trust his senses above doubt. Yet his error was not a simple mistake. It was a symptom of a culture that feared uncertainty more than it feared injustice. Calder signed the death certificate because the system required it, and once signed, silence fell. But silence is not passive. It is active. Silence protects authority. Silence hides mistakes. Silence erases accountability. For the Ashford family, silence was imposed as much by society as by grief. They never challenged the declaration. They never demanded an explanation. They accepted the ritual. They buried John. They photographed him. And they lived with the secret. Decades later, Dr. Fenwick's exhumation tore that silence apart. His report revealed something far more disturbing than a mistaken diagnosis. It revealed a deliberate blindness, a willingness to let the dead rest without proof they were truly dead. It exposed the unspoken truth of Victorian death, that there were no safeguards against burying the living. This was not an isolated incident. Fenwick himself noted other cases where coffins showed signs of struggle, where graves bore evidence of living burial. But those cases were buried in dust and ignored by medical journals. The system had no mechanism for reckoning with them. They were anomalies to be forgotten, not horrors to be examined. The Ashford photograph, preserved for decades, became a silent rebellion against that erasure. It became proof of something no one wanted to admit, that life could be extinguished in ignorance, and that the boundaries between life and death are far more fragile than we imagine. And this fragility is the most dangerous truth of all. For Thomas and William Ashford, the truth of John's burial was never spoken aloud. It lived instead in the shadows of their lives. The photograph of their brother, a solemn, frozen testament, became an heirloom of grief. It was framed in their parlor, passed down through the years, a silent witness to something they could never name. Grief, when unspoken, transforms. For the Ashfords, it became a question without answer. Was John truly gone when they laid him to rest? Or had he lived, trapped in darkness, fighting for breath, only to die beneath the weight of their silence? That question shaped them. It shaped their choices, their fears, their understanding of life itself. Thomas carried it with him to London, where he built a life away from Yorkshire. But even in the bustle of a new city, he could not escape the memory. William stayed, bound to the cottage where John's coffin had rested, where the photograph still hung. For him, the image became an altar of memory, a reminder that truth can be buried as deeply as a body. By the time Dr. Fenwick's report emerged in the early 1920s, the Ashford photograph had passed into history. It was no longer just a family relic. It was evidence. Evidence that would shock medicine, challenge institutions, and raise a question that still lingers. How many others were buried alive, their deaths declared by an authority that could not or would not verify life? The Ashford case became a cautionary tale, not only about the limits of medical knowledge, but about the price of silence. That photograph was proof that mistakes, or worse, intentional blindness, could have consequences far beyond a single moment. It was proof that history is not shaped by truth alone, but by those who choose to speak it. And the Ashford family's silence became a mirror for society, a mirror that reflected our deepest fears, not of death, but of living with lies we dare not name. That photograph is still preserved in private collections. The image remains haunting, not because it shows death, but because it shows something no photograph should ever capture, the possibility that life was buried alive. And the question remains, if we cannot trust those we call to judge death, what does that mean for the very nature of life itself? The Ashford case did not die with the family. It became a shadow in medical history, a ghost case that resurfaced whenever science questioned the certainty of death. Today, forensic pathology treats the Ashford exhumation as one of its most haunting lessons, the day a photograph became a witness to a crime no one wanted to admit. In the decades since Dr. Fenwick's report, medical science has advanced. Monitors now measure heart activity with precision unimaginable to Victorian doctors. Protocols demand verification before burial. Yet even today, the Ashford tragedy lives on as a warning. Because certainty about death is not just a matter of science, it is a matter of trust, and trust can be broken. The Ashford photograph remains a symbol of that fracture. It speaks to a deeper truth, that life and death are not binary, but a threshold. And that threshold is governed not only by biology, but by human choice. Victorian England chose haste. It chose closure. And in that choice, John Ashford paid the price. For historians, the Ashford case is a case study in the corruption of silence. Forensic experts now call it a turning point, proof that the rituals of death, the authority of medicine, and the practices of mourning can conceal as much as they reveal. But for those who study the photograph, it is more than a case. It is a warning. A warning that those in power, whether in medicine, law, or family, can decide who lives and who dies, and sometimes do so without conscience. The Ashford photograph is proof of that danger. Proof that life can be extinguished not only by violence, but by systems that ignore doubt. And it is proof that silence, the silence of doctors, of institutions, of families, is a force more dangerous than death itself. Because silence protects not only grief, but complicity. And the Ashford Brothers photograph is the last witness. The Ashford case is not merely a story of a misjudged death. It is a story of forbidden knowledge, a story of what happens when a society chooses silence over truth, and the price of that choice. When Dr. Fenwick published his report in the 1920s, it was buried beneath a tide of bureaucracy and disbelief. Forensic medicine acknowledged the possibility of living burial, but no institution was willing to face the wider implications. The Ashford case became a cautionary footnote, not a revolution. And that was intentional, because some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. They challenge the foundations of authority. They expose the fragility of control. They strip away the certainty upon which societies build themselves. The Ashford photograph became a relic of that forbidden truth. It was not just an image of grief, it was proof that death could be misdiagnosed, that the rituals of closure could become instruments of cruelty, that institutions could be complicit in silence. For generations, the Ashford family carried that burden without knowing its full weight. For decades, the photograph remained a quiet witness in a parlor. But once Dr. Fenwick revealed the truth, the image became evidence of something far greater, a systemic failure. And it stands today as a warning to those who dare to look. Because what the Ashford case reveals is that death is not the end. It is a process defined by those who claim authority over it, and those who control that authority decide which truths will be spoken and which will be buried forever. The Ashford photograph is not merely a relic of history. It is a message, a warning, a challenge. It asks us, how many John Ashfords lie buried, forgotten, beneath the soil of silence? How many truths are locked away in the name of closure, and how long will we allow ourselves to accept death without question? This is the foreground, or forbidden knowledge buried within the Ashford Brothers story, and it will change the way you see life, death, and the thin line that separates them. Because once you have seen the truth, you can never unsee it. We began this journey with a photograph, a frozen moment of grief, a sepia relic framed in silence. But now you know it was never just a photograph. It was a testimony, a witness, a warning written in shadows. The Ashford Brothers story is not simply a Victorian tragedy. It is an indictment of a world that fears doubt more than injustice, a world that buries truth beneath ritual, bureaucracy, and silence, a world that hands over life and death to those who claim authority, without question, without proof. John Ashford's death was not an accident. It was the consequence of systems built to deny uncertainty, the consequence of trust placed in imperfect judgment, the consequence of silence. And that silence lives on today, not just in forgotten graves, but in every moment when we accept closure without inquiry, when we trust without evidence, when we ignore the possibility that what we call truth may have been buried long ago. The Ashford photograph is the last voice of that truth. It speaks to us across time, asking a question we cannot answer without looking deeper. If death can be mistaken, if closure can be bought with silence, then what else have we accepted without question? This is why the Ashford case matters. Not because it is an isolated mystery of the past, but because it is a mirror for now, for us, for the systems we trust, the truths we bury, and the silence we accept. The Ashford brothers are gone. Their story remains, and the photograph still speaks. Look at it again, not as a relic of grief, but as a warning that life and death are not absolutes, that truth is not given freely, that the greatest danger is the silence we never break. And now the question is yours. Will you? Because once you have stepped into the Ashford story, you can never step away.